Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're here with Alex Hochuli, um, uh, host of Alpha Bunga Bunga with Philip Cutleaf and who else?
George Hoare.
Yeah, I always forget George. I'm a terrible person. Um, and co-author of The End of History. Um, and unfortunately for his Rolodex are, for those of us in the 21st century, his Google Calendar, um, English speaker who talks about Brazil who is not Michael Brooks. So it's a niche defined in opposition um, to a very popular but unfortunately no longer with us human being. Um, and you follow this more than me, but I followed this Lula cycle since the mid aughts. He's I remember kind of infamously Obama calling him one of the most popular elected officials in the hemisphere, when Obama was first elected himself. That said, there has been a cult of Lula developing in the West, which I blame partly on his imprisonment, and partly on the aforementioned late Michael Brooks, that I have always been sort of baffled by. Um, and particularly seeing it not just coming out of the United States now, but recently we've seen Jeremy Corbyn make frankly irresponsible remarks about what was going on in Brazil. Um, and while I think Lula's victory is not without importance, I also think it's being swept under the rug how fucking close it was and how little of uh, a mandate or even strong party backing in the legislature that the Workers' Party has. So, Alex, what is the narrative getting wrong about Lula and Bolsonaro in English, since you can move between worlds here?
Yeah, let me think because I haven't done a entire scan of anglophone media on this. I What I gathered was that the main narrative about the election in the lead up, especially with the New York Times and I imagine the Guardian as well, was this election is about the Amazon. Which it isn't. I mean, it obviously has implications for the Amazon, but that's not what was a dividing line in people's consciousness in Brazil, and um, so I think that's one thing we can dismiss fairly easily and readily. More broadly, Lula, it's very easy to romanticize Lula, and for good reason. He is a kind of unique politician. He is Brazil's greatest 21st century politician and probably the greatest Brazilian politician in the republic, second only to Getúlio Vargas, Brazil's dictator and then a democratically elected president in mid-century. So, he is a great figure. I think that's not deniable. Um, and biographically, I'm sorry if you got motorbikes going on in the background, but that'll give you the authentic flavor of being in the center of São Paulo. Um, but biographically, there's very little to to sort of say against him, I guess. In the sense that he's a federal, grew up in poverty, moved down to the south, to São Paulo, which itself somehow captures a really important dynamic in Brazilian history of internal migration from the poor agrarian northeast to the megalopolises as they became of the southeast, becoming a metal worker, losing a finger in a lathe accident at age 19, becomes the leader of the new syndicalism, which sought to break with the old models of trade unionism, which was always very top down, state managed, and do something which was much more kind of autonomous and organic, from bottom up, but which also did not fit in entirely with, or to a certain extent shrugged off the attempt at leadership from Trotskyists, as well as wasn't captured by the PCB, the Brazilian Communist Party, the official Stalinist party. And then, rose to prominence, becomes a very popular leader, and is able to do something which few do nowadays, which is leave office with a huge amount of popularity, is hated by the right, is hated, so much class loathing is thrown at him. And just maybe a sidebar on that, but it's worth noting that the terms in which he is always attacked by the right are the exact terms which, the upper middle class, the elite will talk about the poor. So, he's a drunkard, a cachaceiro, drinks cachaça, kind of Brazilian rum. He's a thief because if he's poor, he must be a thief, right? That he's untrustworthy and that he's a rabble rouser and, and basically he's corrupt, deeply corrupt. So with all those things, right, and the fact of his imprisonment, which you've already mentioned, it's very hard not to then go, well, but then there must be something good to this guy, right? Um, the reality is that he has been always a very conciliatory figure. That's been his mode of politics. Even when he was a trade unionist, it was always, let's find a deal. He's very good at that. And that was his modus operandi in power. To a certain extent, that was the reason why so much kind of corruption scandals happened around him, because he inserted himself into the machine of Brazilian politics, where you have to make deals, where the wheels of government need to be greased. And if you play that game, well, especially if you're an outsider, from the left and a working class leader, you're the one who's going to get fingered with if there's a turn against corruption at a certain point. So anyway, this is all a kind of bit of a backdrop to say that what this election misses is that, this election was of a broad front, which Lula managed to cobble together with large swathes of the establishment who are going to be not just in Congress, but they're going to be in government. So key ministries are going to be given to figures of the right, of the center right, and he's going to govern as that broad coalition. There's not going to be some secret turn to the left or some secret leftist plan once I'm in government, etc., etc. And so there's rather little to hope for there. And on the other hand, Bolsonarismo has not been vanquished. As you mentioned already, and it's completely right to point out that margin was very narrow. We were all sweating on Sunday night, watching the election results come in. Fortunately, Brazil is a very modern, advanced country, much more so than the backward place from which you're calling, where here the election results are announced within 2 hours, and that was 2 hours in a very tight election. In an election with a larger margin, that would have taken even less time. So fortunately, we weren't sweating for too long. But
yeah, you don't have a 50-state legal quagmire where each state has its own laws on elections constitutionally.
Exactly.
I remember, as a side note, the first time explaining that to a European, and they're like, wait, U.S. elections make so much more sense now because they formally don't make sense. And I'm like, yes,
right, yeah,
yes, they don't.
And it's why it's such a fun circus to watch from afar. But not if you maybe have a stake in the game.
And I was impressed. I was actually, we know that quickly on that close of election that Rick cooked 3 runoff rounds. I mean, it's that said, how's the Workers' Party in general holding up? It seems like it's not doing too well, even if Lula is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the PT has become very Lula dependent. That was clear also because even taking the past 4 years, the PT did very little in opposition. It basically decided to hide away until the next election was kind of round the bend, to start doing anything and leading opposition to Bolsonaro. And it took Lula being released from prison for that to actually happen and for there to be any genuine hope of Bolsonaro being defeated. There's obviously an incumbency bias, right? But also the fact is that despite how terrible Bolsonaro is and has been, as a president, there was no realistic other challenger other than Lula. So on one hand, this is again the kind of slightly perplexing thing about Lula. No other politician could have won this election other than him. So on one hand, wow, that's impressive. On the other hand, it shows how much on a back foot progressive forces are, let alone the radical left is. So anyway, I think the question, I guess, was concerning the PT, and we know that it's become bureaucratized over its period in power. It lost a lot of its base. What's interesting, actually, electorally, is that it has undergone this weird class realignment. So when class realignment is discussed these days in reference to the US or to Western Europe, it's that, well, the workers are now voting for the right, and it's kind of educated middle class who are voting for the left, to put in broad brush strokes. What's happened in Brazil, ironically, is that the PT's base traditionally was the industrial working class, and then the kind of reflexive middle class of intellectuals and artists and all that kind of thing, right?
Which is
What's
historically the base of labor parties, honestly. Like it,
exactly. And what's happened in Brazil is over the period of PT's period in power from 2003 to 2016, it won a new base in terms of the disorganized poor, especially in small and mid-sized cities in the Northeast, the poorest section of Brazil, through these, cash transfers, right, where it lifted millions of people out of poverty and so on. And so that is now the kind of hardcore base of Lulismo, and it's lost the industrial base in part because of deindustrialization. So it's a section of society that is actually withered in size, and lost a lot of the middle class too. So what was amazing about this election, if you look at the breakdown according to income, the only income group that Lula won was amongst the bottom income group, which is those with a household income of up to 2 minimum wages, which is to say something like $440 a month for a family, for a household. So it's people at that level and below that voted something like 65% in favor of Lula. All other income groups voted for Bolsonaro, and of course, the higher up you go, the more they voted for Bolsonaro. So in some ways, that might seem like a good picture for the left. It's like, oh, good, we're winning the working class and not winning the middle class. There's a class polarization there that is good. But the important thing to note is that where that line is set is probably kind of wrong. It's too far, it's too low, which is to say that there's sections of the upper sections of the working class, those perhaps more formally employed, who would traditionally be understood as a kind of workers' party's base, didn't vote in their majority for Lula.
So yeah, that's interesting because in some ways it mirrors the political polarizations of the United States and Western Europe, but in some ways it's distinct. And I mean, one of the things that it mirrors on, and I think this is lost when we talk about the general class trend of Democratic voters is upwards, except for the few poor who do tend to vote Democrats until very recently, and the working and by that we mean people who have some kind of relationship to the state formally. Usually they are underemployed. We might call them lumpen in some cases, or semi-lumpen, or precariat if you want to be more politically sensitive about it. um, People who are below the US poverty line, which is on the global scale. Well, I mean, it's actually not that high when you adjust for purchasing power, but still, and raw numbers seems pretty not super low when you look at like Mexico and Brazil, and you're dealing with monthly salaries of around $300 to $400.
Yeah.
But with that said, that trend actually since Biden has been reversing. There's complications as to that. So while the median GOP voter has not gotten poorer, to say that they're workers is a little misleading too. The vast majority of workers, even in elections that have high electoral turnout, like the last one, the highest we've ever had as percentage category since like the very early 20th century, and we can't really trust those stats. You still see large, huge swaths of working poor. If you are just above the state assistance line, but really not doing okay, you're not likely to vote. I mean,
Yeah.
even in high
Yeah.
mobilized
But which is
kind of.
which is a little bit different in Brazil because voting is mandatory.
Right.
So you have an abstention rate actually, which was around 20%, which is high for a situation in which it's mandatory. But of course, it'll be the least educated and the poorest of who won't have voted, right? So that has a big impact. But the kind of turnout numbers are completely different and are
Right.
shaped by that.
Yeah, it's so, you know one of the things I found very interesting about the U.S. narratives around this was I was hearing cries in the U.S. From people in the progressive left sphere. I mean, friends of mine even, who were saying that there was massive voter suppression in Brazil, and I was like, it's a mandatory election. Like, I don't understand how that works.
But there was.
Okay, so there was. So let's talk
Yeah.
about the voter suppression.
We
How
don't.
does it work?
Okay, massive. There was a very deliberate attempt to prevent people from getting to polling booths on election day,
Okay.
and it was driven seemingly from the presidential palace with basically it was the Federal Highways Police whose chief called for a vote for Bolsonaro, and if I'm not mistaken, I think federal police aren't allowed to manifest themselves politically. But in any case, that happened anyway. And what they did was in certain areas, particularly in the Northeast, which is again very
Mm.
much the Lula and the PT's base, went about carrying stop and searches, blitzes as they're called here, on buses, right? Even intercity buses and stuff, carrying voters to polling booths and stop them and try to delay them from getting to the polling booths and so on. We don't know how much of an impact that has. I think it's more kind of symbolically and politically important than kind of important in the electoral maths. It's hard to know, but it's maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe into the millions who are prevented or dissuaded from voting because of it.
That
Probably
would
not
explain the
enough to.
20%
Well,
non-engagement rate.
actually, no. What's interesting is that generally in the second round, the abstention rate is higher than in the first round, because in the first round you have all these congressmen and senators to vote for, and you have your local congressional race, which sometimes
Mhm.
might not go to a second round. So you have fewer people asking for your vote, and of course, your candidate may be excluded from the presidential race. So fewer people tend to turn up in the runoff. This time it was actually slightly higher by 0.3% or something like that, which indicates, of course, what a pivotal election this was, but also how how much the first round was already just a trial run for the second round, because everybody knew it was going to be Lula and Bolsonaro. There was nothing else. No other candidate polled even in double digits. So it was kind of a weird one anyway. I don't know what there is to read about that, but yes, there was voter suppression, right? And there's other things like the federal electoral court, the top electoral court, mandated that transport be free, right, on election day. So allowing
Mhm.
people who had to work on Sunday to be able to get back and forth and leave their work at a certain hour to be able to go vote and so on. And lots of kind of mayors in small towns and even in the periphery of Rio, started charging for buses or stopped or took buses out of service, all sorts of things like that. And accounts also of bosses putting pressure on their employees to vote for someone, presumably for Bolsonaro, and that there were more complaints about this time than at any previous time. It was like there were maybe 100 last time, and there were 500 this time, or whatever it was. So anyway, there are these things, but I don't think that makes that much of an impact in the electoral math ultimately, right?
Right.
So it's more indicative of what um, you know, I guess what they're willing to do and what they attempted to do. Actually, I mean, one of the things that I ended up concluding in kind of looking back at what has happened since the election of Bolsonaro supporters blockading roads, especially truckers across the country, is that if there was an attempt to mount a coup, or some sort of violent contestation of the election results, creating chaos to then create a sort of demand for the military to step in, which I think is what his supporters have been trying to do, is that if Bolsonaro wanted to do that, it seems that he didn't have enough buy-in from the military police, who are the beat cops organized at a state level in Brazil. And had to rely on probably his ally in the Federal Highways Police to try to do something. And this became clear when the roads were blockaded because the Federal Highway Police refused to remove them. So it was kind of actively conniving with the protesters, claiming that the election was stolen and so on, by not removing these trucks from the streets. And of course, we know how the Brazilian police act. We know how the highways police would act when it's left-wing social movements who blockade the roads. It's rubber bullets, tear gas, and all the rest, and pretty swiftly. So I think, that it's obviously worrying, but on the other hand, it shows how, um, ultimately, as I said, how little buy-in maybe Bolsonaro had from the forces of repression, or maybe, maybe if not buy-in, but they just decided on balance, probably too risky, not worth it. We don't need to do this, and we can work with a Lula government. It's not the end of the earth.
Yeah, I find that interesting in some ways that it, it both is different and in parallel to the most paranoid parts of American progressivism, where there was this fear that like the military would help Trump stay in power uh, through all kinds of assistant placements. And I just remember reading, because I read military news a lot, and going, oh no, oh, he does not have enough purchase amongst the brass for that to ever happen. I mean, including during the Freud uprisings, attempts to uh, resurrect like the Insurrections Act, which had been used in the United States in recent memory, in my lifetime, during the Rodney King riots, even, which was theoretically a smaller event. Um, the military did not say no, and the military told Trump explicitly no, um, which is one of the ways I find interesting about this Brazil election, because it's almost through a mirror darkly. It looks superficially similar to a lot of the things that we've seen in the United States in the past 3 or 4 years. But the context for it, the legal stratification in which it exists in, and the local conditions are actually quite different. And you're right. I think it's funny because I was talking to someone about the Amazon in particular, and I was like, that's our stake in this as the world. But when I talk to anyone from Brazil, they tell me that that's barely on the table. Lula
Yeah.
might do some mild things, but what a lot of people think is going to happen probably isn't. Um, uh, there is you did a lot of reporting in the lead up to this on, however, the changing demographics of the and by this I mean religious demographics of the Bolsonarian right, and the right in general. In Brazil, we are not dealing with the same Catholic ancien regime anymore, which I find to be true in a lot of countries in ways that have thrown off American understanding of what is going on amongst a lot of business owners and reactionaries in Latin America. Can you go into how this may have affected this election, and maybe why American pundits who are trying to understand it got it wrong because they did not predict it would be close?
Well, funnily enough, I mean, I think this is the one area where the similarities with the U.S. are more striking, in part because the U.S. has a hand in this religious transition in Brazil.
Mhm.
So, I'm always really skeptical of reading, Brazilian politics or wherever else through the lenses of the U.S. or through Europe, because they're really different societies with different histories, and there are certain global trends that we can point to, and that's useful, right? But to simply go, okay, well, this just maps. This sounds like the same thing, so it must be the same thing. In this case, I'm always. This is a real moment of Americanization of Brazilian politics, right? So, Brazil, Catholic country, still, towards the end of the Cold War, evangelicals numbered in the kind of 8% or something, single digit percentages of Brazilian society. Why, massively Catholic. The religious transition that's happened is that instead of Catholics becoming more secular, agnostic, atheist, non-practicing, etc., which has happened to a certain extent, the number of declaring no religion um, is something like, I don't know, 12-15% or something. But the real transition, the real kind of movement that's happened is the growth of evangelicals, and particularly neo-Pentecostals and Pentecostals in Brazil. And that happened in the kind of, as of the 80s and 90s, it started growing, and then it exploded in the 2000s and 2010s, to the extent that by 2030 there's the expectation that evangelicals will outnumber Catholics in Brazil, which is really, I think it's hard to
That's
overstate
wild.
how important that is. Because everything in Brazil has passed through Catholicism. Not that it's just that, which isn't to say simply, oh, Brazil has always been this deeply religious country. In fact, kind of to the contrary, Brazil, traditionally known as having this kind of very kind of flexible slash hypocritical attitude where, sensuality coexists with kind of moral commandments of Catholicism, and et cetera, right? I think people who know a little bit about Brazil will already know that, right? Carnival being the kind of great example, but Carnival comes from Catholicism, right?
Yeah, the chill,
And
cool Catholics is basically the image that's always
yeah,
been the case.
yeah, and both both the right and the elite have been Catholic, and at the most extreme, like Opus Dei or whatever. And then the left was also Catholic because it was liberation theology. And what happens as of kind of the 80s and 90s is that liberation theology starts coming apart, in part, through U.S. influence. Evangelical churches, Pentecostals, and so on are funded from the U.S. and start growing, especially in the kind of the urban peripheries of big cities. In Rio in particular, that's where it really began. And it grows amongst the lower middle class initially, but then it really spreads amongst the kind of the working class as a whole, and now all across society as well. And obviously the religion of a neo-Pentecostal like upper middle class person is going to be different from the one in the kind of the precariat or whatever, right? Or of the lower working class or whatever it might be. But so it's not monolithic. It's important to say that. And it also is not simply like, oh, this is US imperialism, which has gone in and changed Brazil for the worse. Those are factors, but it obviously has spoken to a certain need or understanding of the world, in which you have the kind of old certainties falling apart, deindustrialization, a need for sociability, and evangelical churches offer that. They offer a place to meet people, to create a social network. If you're selling some little bits and bobs, to make ends meet, or really that is maybe your main source of income, right? That if you have a network of people that through your church, those are people to sell to as well. Um, and as well as the kind of more questions of meaning that come into that, of some sense of maybe of transcendence, of I don't know, whatever it might be. Now, how does that fit in with politics? It's very, I mean, just at a kind of level of the correlation, the strongest section of society for Bolsonaro is amongst self-declared evangelicals. He wins 2/3 to 3/4 of that group. And the progressive kind of response is just like, oh, these are terrible, I hate evangelicals. And there's always a little bit of kind of class loathing in that as well, in kind of the hatred of evangelicals. But there's obviously very little kind of, from my perspective, redeeming in that creed. But the reality is that it is growing, and looks set to continue growing. And there needs to be some response to that, in part because what has happened at the grassroots level is that where there were trade unions, other civic associations, the the Catholic-based communities, grassroots communities tied to liberation theology, those disappeared, and the evangelical churches filled the void. And the pastors in general will call for people to vote for Bolsonaro. That's not to say that, oh, they're just manipulated by their pastors, but in a kind of situation of a void of authority, the pastor actually is one of the few people who is trusted, and therefore he's saying, if you don't vote for Bolsonaro, all these evil things will happen. Specifically, the family will continue to fall apart. Everyone feels the fragmentation, the falling apart of the family. A few people have two-parent households, the threat of violent crime, the threat of your children getting sucked into the criminal networks, of drugs, of alcoholism, all the rest. In that situation, the evangelical church is able to say, one, through us, you will be able to redeem yourself and work hard, and you'll be rewarded by God with wealth. And also, that if you vote for, these leftists, society is going to fall apart because they're going to turn your kids gay, and they're going to, all the rest of it, right? And the devil's behind every corner, and turn this election into a battle between good and evil. Now, I'm not saying that every evangelical thinks like that, much less every Bolsonaro voter is an evangelical, but it is a major factor in a major social change.
Yeah, I think the erosion of one of the ironies in a Catholic hegemonic country is you're going to have a full spectrum of politics within the Catholic Church, and um, and when mainline Protestantism was dominant in America, you had a full spectrum of politics within mainline Protestantism in America too. Um, as that has fragmented in the United States, we've become more Catholic, actually, which is kind of funny. Um, uh, and evangelicals have sort of declined. They concentrated, right? But what I've noticed is, historically speaking, interestingly enough, and I think this actually parallels developments in the United States, and I don't think this is studied enough. Um, Evangelicalism, particularly Pentecostalism, did have a progressive tinge in the early 20th century, and that has been completely removed from it. And there were
Yeah.
a lot of people who assumed that it was still going to have that progressive tinge in Latin America. And it didn't. It doesn't in Mexico. I've talked to people in Peru. These are places where I have more connections. I've heard the same thing. It doesn't in Peru. And apparently it also doesn't in Brazil. You've had a strong Americanization of that movement. Um, and I find it interesting because in some ways, while it definitely helps a category of the American establishment, there's no doubt about that. Um, it actually is a complicating factor for the U.S. So to see it as one-to-one U.S. imperialism is probably wrong. But it is a case where clearly, and not just in Brazil, just Latin America, there is a shift towards a kind of popular rightism, kind of Bonapartist rightism that is very much in line with what we see with the white evangelical church in the United States, um, and uh, as well as its politicization and it being aligned to one faction being part of that. And I think that's worrying, kind of, but because you're right, leftists don't tend to have a good answer for it, and they don't seem to realize that it's not just ignorance. Like, this is a social safety net. I come from the
Yeah.
southeast of the United States. It was the social safety net. The churches were the social safety net. Like, um it was a way to meet spouses. It was a way to uh get aid. I mean, part of the power of the LDS church here is they pretty much run most of the um like charitable functions in the state. And from a weird fluke in federal law, the Utah can actually even report their charitability as part of their meeting of certain um welfare goals that are block granted out, which is hilarious and weird. But so it is interesting that people don't see that in left terms, this is a dual power project. This is a group that can prove that it can do some of the functions of parastate and state institutions, and give a kind of heroic narrative to the entire project.
Yeah.
And leftists have largely forsaken that in the 21st
Any for
century.
yeah, 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 exactly. They really have. I think there's a lot of I don't know what you would call it, kind of like left envy. There, one could have a lot of left envy of the right in this situation, and not just because of the kind of grassroots organization that the evangelical churches represent. That it filled the vacuum of where the kind of left organizations were, organizations that socialized people into more radical left wing worldviews. But it also, just in terms of the kind of radicalism of Bolsonarismo, looking beyond kind of the question of the evangelicals, at their willingness to blockade roads, their the kind of transgressive aspects, the disregard for politeness and what mainstream institutions tell you what to do, and just a kind of a certain vigor there of rebellion on the right, which confronts a left which is doing the opposite, step by step becoming less challenging to the status quo, becoming more transactional, becoming more, the sell is, hey, I'm gonna do stuff for you. Okay, yeah, oh, you want to talk about Jesus? Okay, no, but you know, but we're gonna give you some more money, and that other bad guy does all these terrible things. Or which is funny. This was an interesting thing that happened over the course of the second round. By the way, that's the kind of state of debate, of political debate, was terrible. I think this is something obviously we witness everywhere in the world, right? Listeners in the US will be like, yeah, okay, what else is new, right? But it was just like the demonology and the kind of religion, it was basically who a challenge to say, actually your side is with Satan, not me, which is crazy. I mean, Brazil is formally a secular state, and its political discourse was never so influenced in that form by the nature of kind of the devil being everywhere, right? And so Bolsonaro obviously used that, and did it win people over? I don't know, but what it does do is it stops any sort of it wrapped up the PT in this sort in needing to combat this discourse, and it prevents any real politics from happening. I don't mean like just discussion of policy, but of discussion of any sort of vision beyond that, right? And that was crazy. And what was interesting is that Lula had set out on the beginning of the campaign, no, I'm not going to get involved in religious themes. I'm not going to go onto that terrain because probably sensibly thinking, this is not a terrain on which I can win. What ended up happening, and his was approach, which was more bread and butter and to a certain extent transactional. Kind of I'm going to give you stuff. I'm going to bring stability back. I'm going to end the chaos, and I'm going to make sure that you have a bit of a better life. You're going to have a beer and a barbecue at the weekend, like you used to have. They have these small joys, and that's going to be good. Whereas by the time the second round rolls around, and the Bolsonarista discourse is like, no, actually, Lula made his wives have abortions and had to, is in league with the devil and is corrupt and blah blah blah, all the rest of it. Lula ends up having to address evangelicals. He comes out with a letter to evangelicals saying, actually, no, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, I blah 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 blah, all this kind of stuff, which seems to me, it's completely inadequate. It's completely inadequate because it's one, you're playing on your opponent's terrain, which is always a bad strategy, but also you're going to be unconvincing on that. I think the left does need an answer to the growth of evangelical churches, to kind of neo-Pentecostals and everything and all the rest. I don't think simply saying, actually, but Jesus was actually a communist kind of thing, which is which has been done. I've received WhatsApp forwards of that sort, of the left trying to counteract the right's dominance of WhatsApp and its own networks, which is a very big deal, by the way. In everybody lives on WhatsApp. If you're not on WhatsApp in Brazil, you don't exist, right? So
Yeah.
and that's across society. It's not like a kind of middle class thing or whatever. So I don't think that's adequate either. It does need to, but it does need, the left does need to find a way to speak to people's desire for holy war. I mean, I said that, I wrote in a piece for Compact concluding that, and I mean, I kind of did that slightly in jest. I don't know how seriously I mean it, but there is obviously a kind of, you called it a heroic narrative, and that might be another way to put it, but to offer people something which says, "Hey, this is who we are, and this is where we are going." The left doesn't answer that because it doesn't really have any answer about who we are other than a kind of weak kind of pluralism, and where we are going, like this, but a bit better, and I don't think that has proved very convincing, and certainly doesn't counteract the right-wing narrative, which is now no longer simply, we're going to let the market decide, or, we're going to put the experts in charge. It's now the new right is doing something else. The new right is promising something apocalyptic, which is a form of politicization. It has opened up politics, but unfortunately, the way the spectrum kind of plays out is one which is pretty disfavorable to anyone who wants to see more radical transformation of society, which isn't dictatorship.
It's interesting because in a way in the US we have a similar kind of apocalyptic narrative, but in another way, what it actually mirrors is the decline of evangelical power. I mean, like in absolute numbers, there are more Catholics than any other Christian group in the United States now. And relative numbers, we're not even a majority Protestant country. We're a majority Catholic and none country.
But that's because of the Latinxes isn't it? The
Yeah.
Latinx, the Latin. I don't know how. No
The
one says it
Latin.
by the.
I just say Latin now because it doesn't actually make anyone angry. Um.
I want to make people angry. What can I say to make people angry? Because I don't buy into any of this bullshit. I hate it. No Latin person actually cares about being called Latino or Latina or whatever the hell. Just don't call Brazilians Hispanics. That's just actually factually
Yeah,
wrong.
that
The rest
just
is fine.
yes. Yeah, Brazilians are not Hispanic. They don't speak Spanish, and um, yeah, it's interesting to see because one thing I think is very quietly happening here is there's both an intensification amongst a smaller and smaller group of left social norms, and it has intensified back to a level that we saw probably before 2016, 17. Um, but that has corresponded with, I don't know if you know, I really follow the American radical left in numbers, but the DSA is shrinking, left media projects are drying up, unless they're highly scholastic and small, like what I do. They've seen stagnation, etc. Uh, and there was a kind of a rebirth of teenagers wanting Stalinism, and I actually think that is partly for the reason that you're saying, that there's a need for for both a heroic narrative and a counterforce. Now, that heroic narrative has like very little purchase even in a pro-socialist United States narrative. There's not a whole lot of people who are going to beat off to Uncle Joe, but
Uncle Joe Biden or
either one, honestly. Uncle Joe, whichever dead vaguely outsider white man you want to read that on
it'd be great
to.
if you were from Georgia, actually, from the state of Georgia. That would be. It's unfortunate. Anyway, that would have
Yeah.
worked. Yeah.
Uncle Joe. Um I love I am from the state of Georgia myself, so I like a good Stalin pun. I can't grow the stash though. But I literally think it speaks to that. I also think it speaks to dual power narratives and counter systemic force in both, not both in a narrative sense, but also in a material sense. As I always told people, one of the ironies of history is like, yes, the Bolsheviks and the SPD invented dual power, but Hezbollah perfected it, and Baptist always knew about it innately. So,
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
yeah, and it's kind of a truth that we're seeing with these right wing groups, and not just Christian ones. I was talking about Israel, and we've seen it with United Torah Judaism Party, which is a weird, like almost Golden Dawn-esque Haraldi movement. We've seen it in Catholic movements too, but it seems to Protestants seem to have a particular gift for it in Latin America. Um, and the one thing that worries me about it that you kind of speak to is it seems like an actual counter systemic force. If things aren't going well for you, and particularly if you're kind of well off, but you could lose it all and you're not truly well off, these kinds of narratives are appealing. I mean, and I think even in the secular sense, like this is why you have even non-religious parents freaking out about LGBTQIA issues, um, in American public schools, even amongst secular parents,
Yeah.
and it's that same demographic, and it's interesting because, like I said, uh, I find Brazil probably more than a lot of the rest of Latin America to be one of the most interesting in ways in which it parallels the US, and also in ways in which it's fundamentally different. Um, and so it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. And so I'm glad when we talked about voter suppression, because my immediate instinct was like, I'm sure there was some, but that feels like a US narrative being applied somewhere else. But since it actually does seem like there was a real attempt at voter suppression, okay, well, what does that explain? Um,
Yeah, and it's also kind of when I hear about voter suppression, it's a term which I never even used until I was writing about it. when I like literally like last week. And I'd never, it was a term I hadn't really ever used and only really encountered in US discussions, which are always kind of legal mechanisms, kind of slightly shady stuff, but at the margins, not a kind of much more direct confrontation like, hey, we're going to stop your bus and not let you get to the polling station.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, I mean,
in the US, all this stuff is indirect, and it's like, let's make voting shitty, but it's not. Let's physically send troopers out to stop you.
yeah.
We used to do that, like back in the 60s, but it's been a while. We've gotten more sophisticated.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the growth of this evangelical right. We've talked about in ways in which Lula is a historically important figure. He's an amazing politician. No one who follows Brazilian politics can deny that. The Workers' Party has, it really did lift a lot of people out of poverty. At the same time, it really hasn't had a, its base is the urban poor, not all of the working class and
some of the rural poor as well in
rural
certain
poor.
areas
Okay,
too. So
yeah.
yeah.
In America, this is often reported in terms of racialization, which I think in Brazil seems complicated.
This is the one. This is the area most of all where using an American lens to understand Brazil will lead me to me strangling you. It's just like it's a perfect way to just confuse everything. And I think just generally the US's experience of race is pretty unique. And it doesn't make sense to understand Europe, and it doesn't make sense to understand Brazil, even though similar. Brazil didn't abolish slavery until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, etc. There are certain similarities. The U.S. Deep South and the Brazilian Northeast, there seem to be some similarities, but the histories are completely different. You did not have the creation of a white working class and the deliberate creation of a white working class who felt themselves integrated into the nation and separate from the rest of separate from the kind of black working class. And so in Brazil, it was deliberately the policy of deliberate miscegenation. Yeah, that's the right way to say it. Of mixing up, of trying to whiten the population, but there was no conception of one drop. It was kind of on the contrary. Let's mix this up and whiten up the population as much as possible. So there's racism, and racism, I think, is probably a more important force in Brazil than in the US today. I would hazard it. I think the US's problem is that both anti-racist and racist combine to sustain race as a category in the US rather than trying to overcome it, and I think that's tragic. And so I think the kind of wokeness bears a lot of responsibility for the perpetuation of race as a category. In Brazil, there's still just a lot of racism, basically, from the top down. Whereas you don't have the kind of I guess you don't have this sort of racism amongst the people in the way they have in the US as a kind of move to divide the working class. Anyway, I don't know what I just did an aside on that, but I think it's important, for listeners not to kind of that's one area where I would really say, like, if you want to understand it, read about Brazilian history specifically, because I think all the trying to read across different countries just confuses matters a lot.
Yeah, I would say Brazil's particularly unique, but all of Latin America, like the reason why we talk about colorlism, which is a nice way to say Latin American racism, is because race is never binary in Catholic countries, and that really was a religious institutional difference that and this is one thing where Marxists in particular can be kind of bad. We often have hard times dealing with leftover religious institutional differences when it comes to stuff circulating in modernity. We're just like, well, that's not material. Well, it was, and it's still with us. There's a Marxist way to handle it, but in general, you start talking about the differences between Catholic and Protestant miscegenation laws having long-term legal effects, and Marxist eyes glaze over. Um, but it really changes the narrative and the way race actually plays out in places like Brazil. And I've tried to explain that and trying to explain the Brazilian right because I was very interested when I was coming out of being a right winger, and a lot of people on the right wing of, say, Compact Magazine are very interested in the Brazilian right. Um, where there's an interest in integralism and in non binary racialist views of how to build a cultural ethnic subject or something like that, um, that go all the way back to early Italian fascism. It really is the Germans and the English who are the weirdos on this.
Yeah.
And so that I think that, you know, I think that leads people to just not be able to talk about Brazilian waste. And when I was reading, stuff about Lula, it was trying to put it in the context of U.S. racial views, and I'm like, that's not going to help you, I don't think, at all. Like,
No. No, not at all. I mean, and again, in Brazil, race and class correlate so closely that there's not much in some ways, race loses its salience as a category. Racism persists, obviously, but race as a category loses its salience because it doesn't have this kind of sort relative autonomy to class that it does in the US. In Brazil, they kind of follow pretty closely along one another.
yeah. Yeah, that is true of my experience of Latin America, where I have lived in general. But Brazil seems particularly complicated because, for example, if you're in Mexico, Mexicanos will tell you that there aren't a lot of black people here, which historically wasn't entirely true, but everybody intermarried so much that as a separate category, it really isn't that much of a thing, um, except for new immigrants. Uh, in Brazil, that seems to have both been true, but also uh, complicated by these class stratifications and the attempt at whitening, which is so far into the Anglo Protestant, American settler mind. The idea that there would have been a let's deal with racism through miscegenation by bringing the good white genes in and making people white would not have occurred to
Yeah.
someone from the antebellum South. It would have horrified them, actually. So that is interesting to me as far as the conceptions of this. And I just wanted to talk about it because I do think there's a lot of ways in which, that's the way that the Times is going to spin it. And then you have the way that Jeremy Corbyn and maybe parts of the DSA is going to spin this. And this is where I wanted to get a kind of balanced view, because I know that you're not a Lula detractor, in the way that you would not say have promoted people to vote for Bolsonaro over you Lula or some weird moderate right wing candidate like, say, Greenwald kind of did. But you are a Lula realist. Um, and so let's
He's
go
he's
into
the
that.
greatest manager. He's the greatest manager Brazilian capitalism has ever had, and the elite should thank him for it. And to a certain extent, this approximation between him and the establishment is fitting. It even shows, and like I'm being kind of ironic here, but a certain sagacity, yeah, wisdom on the part of the establishment to get over themselves, to get over their class loathing of Lula, and go, hey, actually, this is a guy who has run our country pretty well, right? And it, I, I think looking at him in those terms makes a lot more sense. As I've said before, Lula's great accomplishments are biographical and symbolic, much more than they are political in terms of what he's actually achieved. And to the extent that he has political achievements to his name, they only speak to the just rottenness of Brazilian politics and the rottenness of Brazil's elite, which I've called before the worst elite in the world, and I will stand by that. And I don't think you have many competitors. I think someone tried to convince me India, maybe, possibly. I think the Brazilian elite, in terms of an elite which had at its disposal enough power, a kind of naturally rich country and all the rest of it, and a large country, so that its elite stands at a fairly high level kind of internationally, that it was able to do everything that's possible to not develop the country, and I think it's like a real indictment. And so Lula comes in and just really at the edges is able to take 40 million people out of poverty, by doing very little, something financially very little. That's just how bad Brazil is, that, doing little allows you to kind of be this national hero. So I think trying to understand that kind of in its contradiction is much more useful than being kind of pro Lula or anti Lula. Um, anyway, I think, what he will do now in government will be, um, not great. I mean, actually, let me before that, and before talking about the future, because he mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, and he had this take, right, that like this shows how the left can win and so on. No one should be taking lessons from Brazil. I mean, the only lesson you can take is have this great working class leader who's very charismatic, very capable politician, and have him like go to jail and come back out and be this heroic, like have this great comeback narrative. Like that's the only lesson you can take from it. It's not like this has been, this was an election, and I've said this, trying to balance out what the factors are. On the one hand, this was an election which is very hard to win for the non-incumbent, because the incumbent has a huge, capacities at his disposal, and in this case was huge amounts of corruption. I mean, just never heard of in Brazilian history in terms of the spending that has happened to save Bolsonaro's ass, basically. And it didn't do it, but it came close, just in terms of the sheer amount of spending that has happened, both in terms of cash transfer programs, in terms of subsidies to taxi drivers, to truck drivers, cuts to fuel costs, doing everything to combat inflation just in this last year, ripping a hole through the state budget just to basically hold on to power. On the other hand, he's been terrible. 600,000 people died, 700,000 people died during the pandemic. He washed his hands of it. He did nothing. He was corrupt in trying to buy the vaccines. He laughed in people's faces, called them weak for getting COVID and whatever. He delivered nothing, didn't even deliver to the elite, actually, in their neoliberal kind of plans. Only the pension reform was the only kind of big ticket thing he managed to do, which shows kind of his incompetence. Even other kind of right populist nationalist leaders elsewhere today at least give their people something, or would have seen no problem with like trying to manage the pandemic in a sensible way, right? Because you might win people over. He didn't even do that. I think it's pretty kind of extraordinary figure, how little he promises, and that's the sell. He promises nothing, and that's the sell, at least kind of materially. So with that backdrop, and with this massive anti-incumbency bias across the world, and certainly in Latin America, where you're in power, you're going to lose the next election if you're having an election this year or next. From that perspective, you think, well, Lula should have won easily, right? And so when you end up kind of taking those two things and you go, well, maybe they cancel each other out, what you're left with is a story of a left which, in the case of PT, retains its a base which is still solid of 20% of this country, 30% of the country, and then you have Bolsonarismo, which is also very strong and is here to stay. It seems it might fragment, but I think that at least all the currents that fed into Bolsonarismo aren't going away, and that represents 30% of the population, and then you have a middle section there to fight over, and the other 50% or so. So was this a great victory for Lula? No, it was a huge relief, and purely from the perspective of democracy, I voted, number 13, which is the number on the ballot, with gusto, and I did it twice for president, not for the other down ballot things, but in the interest of preserving democracy, because a second Bolsonaro term not only would have been kind of chaotic and dominated the agenda in the way that Trump does in the U.S. And Trump did in the U.S. And I think people argue that even radical Marxist, leftist, etc., who would be who even voted for Biden just to be like, can we shut this guy up and have kind of have the political agenda not dominated by the constant absurdities, right? But not just that, because if that were just the case with Bolsonaro, that would be one thing. But I think the threat would be kind of closure of democracy, probably through kind of constitutional means, not tanks on the street, but he probably would have enough support if he had won in Congress, maybe to start, just withering away democracy, right? And clamping down on the press and so on, in similar fashion to what happened with Erdogan in his later terms, and Hungary with Orban in his second term,
And
especially,
what's
and so
likely to
on.
happen in Israel with Netanyahu. So
Exactly. And so, I think I voted for democracy to get rid of that, and now is another day to fight. Lula has never been able to resolve, even in the slightest, the crises of Brazil, and to a large extent, um, the best way to characterize it is, um, dealing with some of the consequences of the crisis while accelerating the crisis itself. And that's something that happened over his period in power, of kind of deindustrialization, kind of disaggregation of the population through this, inclusion through consumption, as it's called, right? So being able to participate in society, which is fantastic, and actual integration of people who had never really had a part in Brazilian society, but done that only through consumption. Which then, when the economic tides turn and the elites go, "Hang on, we're putting an end to this," when the win-win game comes to an end, that suddenly the economic rug can be pulled out from people, and so their entry into society, their integration, suddenly disappears remarkably quickly. Even the biggest thing that Lula is most proud of, and you cannot kind of say a bad word against this, is the fact that he solved hunger in Brazil, which had long blighted the country, despite the fact that it's an otherwise rich country. Now you have 30 million people going hungry again. And so it's remarkable how fast that can change without any kind of reform, and without any reform having been carried out, which would have weakened his enemies, which he never did. And I think that's perhaps in some ways the most damning thing, and most indicative of a party which abandoned its programmatic aspects and then sought to govern just for governing's sake, to be the fair face of capitalism. Um, and to do otherwise would have meant some confrontation with established interests, to carry out, for example, political reform, to get rid of all the kind of corrupt bastards who sit in Congress and get reelected year after year, and just prevent any programmatic agenda from being pushed through, even from the right that much, but certainly not from the left. And so the absence of that, of seizing the possibility of confrontation, even which would have been at the risk of being thrown out, shows what their priorities were. And the I guess the I don't want to call it blackmail, because that's maybe unfair, but the argument that's always used in defense of the PT is, well, but they took 40 million people out of poverty. He kind of solved hunger for so many people, and you go, well, yeah, that's you can't argue with that. Um, but it but if you end up back in the same place you were in, 10 years down the line, then it's hard to say, well, this is progress.
particularly when you talk about things like, well, how's Brazil going to deal with the end of easy loans, our cash transfers, the cost of the dollar, the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative has been severely stalled and China's largesse has largely been pulled back. There's that BRICS, as a coalition, was not strengthened by the Russia-Ukraine war at all. In fact, it seems to, despite superficial talk from India and China, put India and China more at odds, and Brazil kind of is stuck in the middle of that. I guess South Africa can. I don't know what South Africa
No one's
really
interested
does.
anymore. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
you want to hear a tragic story? That's an even more tragic one than Brazil. So
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, the BRICS. Although, one of the problem is, 3 out of the 5 countries in BRICS are going to be listed with the worst elites that the world has.
yeah,
Period. So, you know, I'm always like, well, China clearly is the only one of these factors that has a lot of like control over its
yeah,
elites, at all. So, um, and so it was never like, I remember looking at BRICS and going, well, that's only coherent in so much that it's not the IMF, but that's all that makes it cohere. Um, so I'm with you, in the sense that I do sincerely celebrate Lula's victory, but I don't feel very good about it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's how I feel. I was out on Sunday celebrating with 100,000 people out on the streets in the center of São Paulo, and it was great. But and I think we're entitled to celebrate. It's been miserable. Brazil's been in kind of permanent crisis for the best part of a decade, certainly 8 years. So it's nice to be able to celebrate, but you wake up the next day and you're okay, maybe after the World Cup, because we're not there yet, and Brazil will be world champion for the sixth time, and so we'll celebrate that too. But then the serious business begins, because it's not like it's not a rosy picture in any way. And I think there's something maybe we can discuss, I don't know, but how opposition will look during a very conservative Lula government, a more conservative one than was in place in the 2000s.
Well, this is one of the things I think is interesting for the left trying to reframe this as a new pink tide coming in, like the end of the aughts, the beginning of the aught teens. And I I have been a dampener on that, just because I was skeptical of the Chilean constitutional referendum going the way people wanted. I actually didn't predict it going quite as bad as it did go, but um I've been skeptical of the Castillo government being able to build a coherent coalition to stay effective, and I am probably more than most a big old skeptic of AMLO. So Brazil always gets thrown around as like the weird odd person out, but I'm always like, yeah, but also Lula is both objectively the best politician, but has the most moderate actual history.
Yeah. And
Even
so
a,
there's another irony about the original pink wave 1.0,
mm,
which was that it was Brazil was the most moderate out of a lot of them, though of course has the most weight on the continent. But it was the only one which didn't have a mass revolt from below.
mhm,
So the other ones all still had to, in some sense, speak to the desires of the streets. Whereas in Brazil, it kind of happened in total end of history, post politics mode, where like nothing was really kind of going on. So that explains it to a certain extent. Ironically, when the mass uprising happened, it was in 2013 while PT were in power. And that is a major pivot point in Brazilian recent history. I think you cannot understand Brazil today without at least starting from 2013 and looking forward. And that uprising was something that was huge. Every capital in the country, every large city, medium-sized city, etc. And that was something which was captured by the right. And PT was not able to respond to it in while it was in government. If anything, it responded either with repression or indifference or just frankly confusion, then announce a couple of extra measures, kind of social measures, but not really understanding the depth of the legitimacy crisis that was on show then. And so that's a kind of weird weird sort of irony, that the other pink waves were driven to a certain extent by the streets or by things happening, the grassroots level outside of institutional politics. In Brazil, it was the opposite. It was rather than that the grassroots happened, while PT were in government.
it's interesting because you're right about Latin America, but again, this is the mere darkly weird parallel to the States, where the highest, uh, the most civil unrest that we saw during, began during the Obama period, even if it was left wing. In fact, that was weirdly the beginning of a return to the American left happens in response against Obama,
Yeah.
um, which is largely forgotten and rebranded almost instantly because it was also with the Republican Congress, so everyone could deflect to the Republican Congress. Divided government. Uh, Interestingly, I also think that's why the right has never completely captured uh, the anti-systemic current in the United States, but it looks increasingly more where it's at. Um, uh, and that that's weird when you're looking at like these, frankly Bonapartist figures who, like Uldragon, are Netanyahu, who's like, well, you guys keep coming back, even when you lose, you come back. And when you die, because a lot of these people are now in their middle 70s, um, what's going to subsist after you, it's hard to say. But I am now a believer that there will be something pretty nasty subsisting after these people, these individual figures go away, even if there's no, unlike, the various fascisms, there's no doctrine of Trumpism or doctrine of Netanyahuism except about the Palestinians. Um,
Yeah.
but but there is. I don't think it's going. These individuals are going to be the end of these movements at all, and that
Sorry,
worries
finish
me
your
for
point. Yeah.
Brazil. That worries me for Brazil, because I do wonder, like, well, what's it going to look like when Lula has to rule center right, or just center, even more than he did last time. And it looks like the counter systemic forces in the Bolsonarismo,
Yeah,
or whatever.
I I think the question, of course, and looking at the kind of new right or the far right, whatever you want to call it, the fact we don't have a term for it is maybe telling in its own right, that it doesn't have any programmatic content, and when it gets into power, it just does culture wars and neoliberalism, basically, to put it in kind of most basic terms. And you don't have Meloni trying to take Italy out of the EU, for example, which would be the big risk from the perspective of the European establishment, and of markets globally and everything else. So what, and Trump as well. They didn't do any. There's kind of fomenting of culture wars and whatever, but there's no kind of real
He did
programmatic
not
content.
end NATO like he threatened to.
Right, exactly, which would have been cool, but um, so anyway, and in Brazil, I think there would be an opening for a kind of post neoliberal, and that really is a terrible word. But we are where we are. Again, I think it's telling of the confusion of the times that we don't even have terms other than new and after, right? So it's all post neo, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Or just calling everybody a fascist,
or
like.
just calling everybody a fascist, which is even dumber. So this new right doesn't have a program. What if at some point someone stumbles on the fact that, hey, what if we actually promised people something materially and try to reorganize society? Then the grassroots that they have already built up and been able to sometimes demonstrate their capacity to mobilize, their willingness to be radical and to not be frightened off by warnings from the establishment of don't say that or you can't do that or whatever, then that would be a potentially quite potent force and genuinely Bonapartist, I think, in a way that we haven't seen yet. So
Yeah.
hopefully, obviously, that doesn't happen. Hopefully, they're not listening to this and getting tips. But
Yeah, my critique of Trump was always that he doesn't actually, he doesn't actually believe in much. If you listen to his speech, he says something that uh actually appeals to any kind of right winger and some moderates, if depending on what you're focusing on. Like, he can be anti-war and pro-war at the same time. That's a gift that his particular brand of yawning does. But I always remember people being, really afraid of Bannonism, and me going, well, if they actually did it, yes, we should be afraid. I don't actually think they've transformed their party enough to actually do it. Um, and for all the decay of the Republican establishment, which is still going on here, our establishment is rotting before our eyes. Uh, it it is interesting to think of what would have happened if Trumpism had actually delivered on anything other than just being nasty.
yeah,
If it was, it was just mean neoliberalism with some concessions to tariffs, like,
yeah,
um, if it actually had, I don't know, I was always like, well, what if Trump is the person who, in order to defund universities, forgives all the student loans? Like, just saying, like, all these are illegitimate anyways because these institutions suck. Let's end federal support for the universities, and you know, and not that I would have thought that that was good exactly, but I was like, if he means what he says, he might do something like that. And there, there is a fear if he comes back. I'm not so sure he's even going to come back. I don't know. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical, and I also think that there's a you want to talk about a blackmail, that having Trump in the wings as the boogeyman to scare people back into the Democrats, particularly compared with the Supreme Court, is basically all the Democrats are running on, is negative
Yeah.
partisanship now and fear of Trumpists, um,
Yeah,
which should be worrying, actually.
and so the kind of DeSantis example of the kind
Hmm.
of continuity Trumpism, but with more kind of institutional face, I suppose, or more, I don't know how you'd put it. I don't want to say moderate, but more politically astute, more traditional, I guess, in a certain sense. Not culturally traditional, but kind of following the traditional rules of politics. I think a similar thing probably is happening in Brazil. Um, the stasis, the kind of immobilism of Brazilian politics, and of kind of more broadly, I guess, the sort of end of history, is witnessed in the fact that it's able to absorb. And here I'm saying this about Brazil, but I'm also thinking about other countries where similar things apply, where the establishment is able to absorb all kind of a lot of that energy and just, okay, so now we're going to do the same thing, but from more to the right, with more kind of populist theatrics, with more culture war, with maybe a bit more kind of some measures against neoliberalism in certain ways, if that applies in that country. In Brazil actually happens not to, but basically it's able to absorb it. And I think that's probably what's going to happen in Brazil to a certain extent. The A lot of the Bolsonaro's party, the Brazilian parties don't mean anything, by the way.
Mm.
The only, like, PT is the only party in the country, in which is a stark statement, but it's more or less true. It's the only mass organic real party in the country with an ideology of some sort. But a lot of the in Congress, most likely a lot of the PL, his party, is actually going to be brought into the governing coalition, which is remarkable. Um, but at the same time, I suspect that whatever happens, maybe Lula ends up getting impeached, or I don't know. We don't really know, but that they'll be able to like absorb Bolsonarismo, but from a kind of more establishment position without the sort of outsiderness, and that's sort of, I guess, similar to President Ron DeSantis in the U.S.
Right. It's. I mean, in some ways, in cultural politics, actually, Ron DeSantis is nastier than Trump, but
Yeah,
he works through official channels. He's not interested in gutting the entire government apparatus, which uh, Trump Trump always talked like he was. He didn't actually do it, although supposedly now he has a plan to actually deliver on it. Who knows? I mean, like the thing is, I'm hearing that reported from liberals who are trying to scare establishmentarians into being loyal in the midterm. So it's hard to actually know how serious these threats are. But I will say January 6th did happen. But again, it is weird because it was one of those times where it looks like, well, counter systemic power is on the right, even when they're in the presidency and leaving. And that's hard to, that's a hard sell when you're like, okay, well, how do we fight these people who are claiming to be counter systemic even when they're in power? Um, and that's something we have to take more seriously, and we have to have a better narrative and a better sell, and we don't really. I mean, the the lessons learned in America from this time period have been mostly de-radicalizing, um,
yeah,
on the left, and in so much there is any radical movement on the left, radical narrative on the left, it's all about foreign countries of which U.S. voting populace has no real input even to how the U.S. responds to them. So it's not going to have a lot of appeal. Um, so this is a kind of this is a mixed bag. I mean, if Bolsonaro had won, I think we'd be having a much darker conversation. So people who think that we're being dark uh, should probably back off a little bit. But I do think there's a real sense that we should be worried that that even though PT is the only party in Brazil, I still don't know what the Workers' Party actually really is, even though it is a mass organic party with some ideology that has some real class basis, even if it's not the class basis it traditionally had. Um, I don't know what it means. You know what is trabalhismo really in Brazil, other than Lula, and that's worrying. Um,
Yeah, and there's
particular
no leadership even. I mean, not to bring it down to personalities, but I think it is indicative that there aren't young leaders rising up. The guy who Lula tried to put in place in 2018 to run in his place when he was imprisoned, failed, lost, and he's now lost three elections in a row because he ran for governor of some and also lost. And he's kind of he's a kind of central left technocrat. And anyway, the point being is that there's not any real kind of new leaders emerging through the party. So
that's true. That is another way in which the Party Trabajo actually does look a lot like the Democrats, because we also have no real new leadership coming out of, I guess, AOC, but not I, I, AOC polls slightly better than Kamala Harris, but only slightly.
yeah,
Um, which, Kamala Harris is probably the most unpopular vice president since Dan Quayle. Um, and and I think people, uh, I think the U.S. I was recently sharing an article actually by normies when I was just like, look, even the normies are asking, why do U.S. progressives love celebrity losers, like people who come from technocratic backgrounds and literally lose election after election, and we keep throwing them at the wall as if we could create a young coterie with them, and we don't seem to be able to do it. And there's no one in the back wings. I mean, clearly, honestly, that's why we got Biden, because it's not like he's a particularly strong leading candidate, and it's just Obama and Clinton can't run again.
yeah.
Um, um, anyway, I don't mean to make it all about America, as we are narcissists and don't want to do. Brazil, I do want to emphasize, Brazil cannot be totally read through the American lens. It rhymes, but for different reasons. Um, and I'm glad you came on the show. Thank you for your time. I know you are in high demand these days. You've probably been on 50 podcasts in the last week, because you're one of the few people who can speak to Brazil fairly. Um, Neither a Lula hater nor a Lula lover, and that puts you in high demand. And you speak English, so that helps.
Yeah, thanks very much, man. I appreciate it, and yeah, it's been a good chat. I've enjoyed this. Yeah, and if people are being like, "Oh, you're being too harsh, you're being too dark," the one we kept celebrated. That's good. That's done. Nothing's to be gained from continuing celebrating. Into what looks like a pretty difficult situation. So we will see.
Yep, we will see. Thank you. People can check you out on off of Bumba Bunga,
Yeah,
and
BungaCast, wherever you care to search for us.
BungaCast. They can read your book, uh, the end of history. Although, according to Francis Fukuyama, it's the end of the end of the end of history. Um,
Can't trust
I
him.
don't. Yeah, Uh, to make a mild defense of Fukuyama, actually, he's never said what people think he's saying, but you still can't trust him. Um, um, uh, and thank you for coming on. So have a great evening.
Cheers, you too.
Bye bye.